Welcome back to the Section 121 Leader podcast. I'm your host, Stanley Black. So this episode is much more about my personal experiences than discussing a specific scripture verse. I've had multiple people that have given me feedback that my messages would be richer if I shared more personal experiences. So if you like personal experiences, feel free to keep listening to this episode. If you'd rather stick to just the scriptural discussion, go ahead and skip this episode. So as people asked me to integrate more of my experiences into the content here, what I realized specifically about this podcast is that the reason this section of the Doctrine and Covenants means so much to me is that I have such a collection of frustrating experiences that came from leading incorrectly. Particularly as I have recorded the episode previous to this one, I reflected that for most of the things where I am very direct in explaining how not to do something, it is because I've seen the negative results of not leading in the Lord's way in my own life, or in the lives of others. Would it surprise you to find out that for most of my life, I have not felt valid as a person? I am slowly starting to see that so many of us have massive insecurities and things that cause us to not feel valid as a person. But until recently, I thought it was just me. Why? Because for the most part, I saw others with their trials and challenges, and I thought that seeing them work through their trials made them even more awesome in my eyes. But for some reason, I never connected the dots. I felt so inferior that I have desperately been trying to catch up throughout my life. I was born the youngest of 9 children, with an 8-year gap between me and the closest sibling and a 23-year gap between me and my eldest sibling. I have parents who have very strong testimonies of the gospel and a legacy of awesome family spiritual experiences. My siblings are smart, caring, and influential in their chosen vocations and roles. My siblings were in high school and college as I grew up, so I was nicknamed the Little Professor, because of my tendency to use big words because I grew up with a college-level language being spoken in the home. I also grew up with lots of allergies and sickness. For me, early childhood was a mixture of enjoying time with the family and being sick a lot. I was allergic to sugar, chocolate, pork, and all milk products. This meant that something as innocuous as enjoying a war dinner or community event would take me out of commission for 3 to 7 days unless my mom watched me like a hawk and kept me from eating everything I shouldn't. The nature of my allergy was that eating those things would cause my digestive system to shut down so badly that I couldn't even drink water and had to be very carefully nurtured back to health and back to functioning of my body. The dietary restrictions also meant that I was extremely skinny and did not have the muscle mass or energy that most children my age manifested. I wasn't good at sports, except running, and the overwhelming impression I had about most other sports is that they were just varying creative ways to inflict pain on oneself. I discovered as my nieces and nephews were born that I absolutely loved being the leader. Leading and teaching, where people would look to me for direction and management of the group, were very natural and fun for me. I just loved the process of getting a group of people to enjoy doing something together. My mom believed in the value of hard work, and I knew that unless nieces and nephews were visiting, I would have to be working. It became a massive game and challenge for me to try and keep the entire group of all my nieces and nephews who were visiting happy, because I knew that if someone went crying to the parents, they would realize what time it was and decide to go back home and put kids to bed. Of course, I loved my nieces and nephews and genuinely enjoyed the time together, but I took enormous satisfaction from my ability to have fun while simultaneously keeping the entire group engaged. In the Myers-Briggs Temperament Indicator, I am an ENTJ, and it says very clearly about this type that this sort of individual can't not lead. I almost fell out of my chair the first time I read that as a young adult because it explained this deep inherent compulsion I had to be the leader. However, outside of my family role as an uncle, leadership was hard to come by. Remember that from an outward appearance perspective, I had none of the attributes that people traditionally look for in a leader. I wasn't tall, I wasn't comparatively handsome, I wasn't strong, I didn't have a pleasing voice, and I wasn't charismatic. All I had going for me was my intelligence. But as anyone who has met a bully in middle school knows, Book smart is not much of an advantage at that age. By halfway through 6th grade, the pressure of the bullying combined with the academic stress and my inherent physical weakness meant that I would get sick any time I went back to school. As a result, my parents decided to homeschool me. For my first assignment in homeschool, my mom wanted me to decide what was the most important thing to learn. After struggling with it for a bit, I ended up telling her that I thought it was the gospel of Jesus Christ. She agreed and said our homeschool would be centered around it. I cringed, because I was certain that this homeschool thing now meant that I was going to become more of a gospel scholar than I already was, but an academic idiot. To my surprise, and as a credit to her wisdom, I discovered that integrating the gospel into all learning didn't hamper my progress at all, but rather made things easier to remember and use. I was excited to go on a mission when it was time, because for once I felt this would be a place where I could be the leader I wanted to be. Since God picked the leaders, and He knew what I knew, and since my gospel scholarship was greater than most people I knew, I thought it would be very natural for me to lead. It is important to note that being a missionary was pretty much the first experience of my life where I persevered through something that was hard and completed it with a feeling of legitimate accomplishment. See, I was in Cub Scouts, but Cub Scouts had a requirement for several physical things like rolls and sit-ups and crunches. I literally couldn't do them. So my progress through Cub Scouts stopped at that point, and I never got beyond Bobcat. I got into Boy Scouts and proceeded through till the swimming requirements. I literally couldn't do them, no matter how hard I tried. I distinctly remember the sinking feeling I had of feeling stuck, and that I would continue to go to young men's scouting activities, but that me getting my eagle was literally hopeless, and I just had to accept non-achievement, and therefore would never be the example that could get me into a position of leadership. Luckily, there was a scout leader who was determined to teach me to swim. He worked with me long enough, not to get me to swim, but long enough to make a formal recommendation to the scouting board that the swimming requirements should be waived for me. That got me to the next rank, and I was able to complete the Eagle. I remember my Eagle Court of Honor. I was astounded at all the positive words people said about me. I was shocked to find out that people thought I had been doing a good job. I just assumed that it would be a simple ceremony where I would get the badge and people would talk about scouting principles. It was so amazing and so encouraging to hear all those good things. But even now, whenever I have sat in the Eagle's Nest for the Court of Honor for others, I have always felt like an imposter, because I was so weak and incapable that they changed the rules for me, rather than me rising to the standard that everyone else has to abide by. But back to the mission. I thought, surely I can win legitimately here. Surely superior knowledge means that I can finally lead here. But I was not made my MTC district leader. I was so disappointed. I was in the MTC for Y2K. I was convinced that there was going to be negative things that would happen and we needed to be ready for them. I was astonished at the complacency of the people around me. I prayed for guidance and was so determined that I basically forced a revelation. I wrote down my impressions and shared them with the district leader. On guidance from the branch president, he chose not to share them with the district. I was disappointed. Y2K came and went, and nothing that had been in my revelation happened. That is, to anyone except me. The negative things in it happened specifically to me. That is where I got my first clear instruction of why it is important not to try and force spiritual things. I felt pretty dumb. At that point, I pretty much gave up. It was clear that I just wasn't going to get to be the leader. First, I had proven I was dumb. Second, I hadn't trusted like I should have. Third, it just validated all my other life experiences that said that I just didn't get it, that I just wasn't good enough, that I needed to just sit down and be a worker bee and let the people who were born with more pleasing physical attributes lead. However, in my second area of my mission, I was very displeased with my district and zone leaders and their lack of attention to exact obedience, that I decided I would try and go for leadership again, since if this was all the Lord had to work with here, then maybe He could actually use me. So I started working on the memorization of scriptures that was required in my mission before becoming a leader. I pushed through and got the certification. 2 areas later, when transfer calls came, and I still wasn't chosen as a district leader, I took it up with the Lord in prayer. I was pretty frustrated. To my great surprise, I was informed in that prayer that I had not yet learned to be a good missionary yet, and that was why I wasn't being chosen as a leader. I was shocked and started reevaluating my actions and what I was doing. I started trying to be the very best missionary I could. Also in that area is the first time that I really studied Section 121 of the Doctrine and Covenants in depth, and came to see that if I wanted to be a leader in God's kingdom, I would have to learn to lead in His way. I was astounded that before I left that area, a member of the ward referred to me as charismatic. I never would have dreamed in a million years that someone would use that adjective to describe me. In my next area, I got to be a trainer, a district leader, and even a zone leader. And most importantly, I did finish my mission with the full impression of having actually done well and accomplished something without being a fraud. The mission wasn't the only time the Lord has brought me back to Section 121 to teach me again, particularly any time that my pride got out of hand. I have more stories to share, but I think this is enough for one episode. Just know as we continue through the episodes that I have stories for almost every key point that I have to share. I will try to incorporate them more as I go along, as I have the courage to do so. It is just that so many of the stories involve me making a mistake and missing a key piece of information that led to a less than desirable outcome. When it feels like being smart is all you have going for you, any evidence of mistakes or foolishness becomes terrifying to share. However, I also do feel called to help people understand. And if my stories will help people understand, then maybe it's worth sharing them, even though they let you see how many times I made foolish, fearful, and prideful errors in my life. So for those of you on this podcast journey so far, I'm curious for your feedback. Feel free to drop me a line at coach.stanley.black@gmail.com and let me know if you appreciate my sharing my story. Do you want me to integrate more stories into this podcast? Or would you prefer that I just stick with explaining Zion leadership concepts and let you extrapolate the meaning and the application? Till next time.